One Brooke Pierce, 31, had spent most of her life learning how to smile half a second after being humiliated. That tiny delay was the difference between surviving a family dinner and giving her mother the satisfaction of seeing her crack. On my wedding day, I used that same smile again. I was standing beneath a canopy of warm Edison lights inside a restored glass conservatory in Asheville, North Carolina, wearing a fitted silk gown I had paid for myself, watching 200 guests rise to their feet as the officiant introduced the parent toast. And all I could think was this: when my older sister got married, our mother stood with a crystal glass in her hand and gave a 30-minute speech about grace, brilliance, legacy, and how some daughters are born to light up a room. People cried, people clapped, people talked about that speech for months. At my wedding, my mother stood up, adjusted the microphone, smiled the way people smile right before they say something cruel and call it humor, and said, "Try not to mess this one up, Brooke." Then my father chuckled into his champagne, nodded like she'd said something clever, and both of them sat back down. The room exploded. Not everyone laughed hard, but enough did. Enough for me to hear it in layers. Enough for the sound to travel from the front tables all the way to the back wall and come back to me like an echo. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I turned my face toward my husband and held my glass steady even though my fingers had gone cold. Because when your own family has been training a room to laugh at you for years, you learn not to give them the second act. I wish I could say that was the worst part of the night, but it wasn't. The worst part came later, after the music started, after the candles burned lower, after I found out that what they did in public was still gentler than what they were saying in private. Before I tell you what I heard that night, and why they ended up calling me 38 times 3 months later, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I always wonder how far a story like this can travel before it lands in the hands of someone who's lived it too. The reception moved on as if nothing had happened, which somehow made it worse. The band slipped into an upbeat soul set. Servers glided between tables with champagne and small plates, and guests leaned in beneath warm amber lights to tell me how beautiful the ceremony had been. I thanked them, smiled on cue, and kept my shoulders loose the way I'd trained myself to do in high-pressure rooms at work. But inside, I felt as if I'd been pushed outside my own body and left to watch the rest of the night from a distance. My wedding had become a performance I was still physically present in, but no longer emotionally allowed to inhabit. Evan noticed before anyone else did. He kept stepping back into my orbit with little, quiet acts of protection, taking a half-finished conversation off my plate, guiding an overly chatty guest away when he saw my expression harden, bringing me water before I asked. Once, while a photographer arranged a candid group shot near the floral wall, he leaned toward me and murmured, "You don't owe this room a single fake second more than you want to give it." I almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because he was the first person in my life who said things like that without expecting me to immediately defend my family. For a while, I tried to anchor myself in the details I had chosen with care. The string quartet version of our favorite song during dinner. The hand-lettered place cards I had designed myself after midnight over 3 separate weekends. The blue hydrangeas and white ranunculus at the center of each table because I wanted the room to feel bright without looking fragile. I had built this night piece by piece, and I hated that one sentence from my mother had managed to crawl through every beautiful part of it like ink dropped into clear water. Then came the toasts from friends. My college roommate told a story about the time I drove 4 hours in a thunderstorm to help her move out of a toxic apartment because she was too scared to do it alone. Evan's best friend said he had never seen him so certain about a future with anyone. People clapped. People smiled. A few even looked genuinely emotional. And for a brief stretch of minutes, I thought maybe the night could still be salvaged. Maybe the ugliness would stay small if I refused to feed it. That illusion lasted until Madeline drifted past my table in a fitted satin dress that somehow looked chosen to compete with me, and said, loud enough for the bridesmaids nearest us to hear, "Relax, Brooke. Mom's joke landed because people were already nervous for you. It broke the tension." She didn't slow down after saying it. She just kept walking, holding her champagne flute like she'd tossed a lit match over her shoulder and knew the fire would catch. I stared after her, and one of my bridesmaids, Hannah, quietly asked, "Did she really just say that?" I gave the smallest nod, and Hannah's face changed in a way I'll never forget. Not pity, recognition, as if she had just understood in one sentence what kind of family I had come from. About 20 minutes later, I slipped away under the excuse of checking on the dessert table because I needed one area of the evening where no one was asking me to emote. The conservatory had a narrow side corridor that led toward the back service terrace, and as I walked down it, I passed the coat room, where I suddenly remembered another wedding, another hallway, another version of myself. At Madeline's wedding 2 years earlier, I had been the one fixing disasters in heels, finding safety pins for a torn hem, calming my mother down when the cake arrived with the wrong piping, driving back across town for the guest book because no one else had noticed it had been left behind. That entire day, people kept telling Madeline she was glowing. They kept telling my mother she must be so proud. And they kept handing me problems to solve, as if competence were the closest thing I was ever going to get to celebration. The memory hit so sharply that I actually stopped walking. Then I heard laughter from the terrace. Not generic laughter. The intimate kind that comes from people feeling especially free to be mean because they assume they are among allies. I stayed just out of sight and listened. Madeline was speaking first, animated and smug. "I'm serious," she said. "Evan's nicer than she deserved. Brooke's always been the kind of person men admire in theory and avoid in real life. Too intense, too corrective, too much." Another woman laughed and asked, "Then how'd she pull this off?" Before Madeline could answer, my mother stepped in with the ease of someone adding a final polish to a familiar insult. "Because he likes fixing things," she said. "And Brooke has always needed management." My father gave a low laugh. At least now it's his full-time job. Someone actually snorted into their drink. A second later, my mother added, "Let's just pray she doesn't start one of her little control episodes before the honeymoon." That phrase, little control episodes, landed with a special kind of violence because it was built from years of weaponized family language. That was what they called it whenever I noticed something important before everyone else did. Whenever I asked direct questions, whenever I refused to act impressed by chaos pretending to be spontaneity. They turned my competence into pathology because it was easier than admitting I was the one who saw what others ignored. I should have stepped out then. I should have let them choke on the sight of me hearing every word. But something in me had changed. I didn't want another fight they could later rewrite as Brooke being dramatic on her big day. I wanted information. I wanted the truth in its raw form, unedited by shame. So I kept listening as Madeline said, "Honestly, if this marriage crashes, Mom can't say nobody warned her." And my mother replied, "If it does, we'll pick up the pieces like always. That's what family does." I stood there so still, my bouquet ribbon brushed against my wrist with every pulse in my hand, because there it was, the full architecture of it. Publicly, I was the unstable one. Privately, they were already predicting my failure, rehearsing their righteousness, and positioning themselves as the generous survivors of damage I hadn't even done. When I finally walked back inside, the first dance was about to begin. Evan took one look at my face and knew something had shifted beyond the toast. We danced anyway, because I wasn't going to let them take that too. But while the room blurred gold around us, I told him in a voice so low no one could hear, "I just found out they don't humiliate me by accident." His jaw tightened. He didn't ask me to calm down. He didn't say maybe they meant well. He just rested his forehead against mine for 1 second and said, "Then we stop pretending you owe them endless chances." That line stayed with me longer than the song did. By the end of the night, I had smiled through photos, thanked relatives I barely knew, cut the cake, changed into the reception shoes I'd hidden under the head table, and waved goodbye under a tunnel of sparklers. Everyone around us saw a polished ending. What they didn't see was the quiet decision already forming under the silk and flowers and applause. I was done confusing endurance with love. Marriage, for the first month, looked normal from the outside. We unpacked registry gifts, argued playfully over where the espresso machine should go, forgot to mail 3 thank you cards on time, and laughed at how many monogrammed dish towels 2 adults could possibly receive from one extended family. I went back to work, reopened spreadsheets, sat through executive review meetings, and resumed my life with the sort of outward efficiency that makes other people assume you're handling things well. But beneath that surface, something was splintering and reorganizing at the same time. I didn't fall apart all at once. It happened in fragments. A song from the reception came on in a grocery store, and I had to abandon the cart near produce because my throat locked up out of nowhere. A coworker complimented my wedding photos, and I heard myself say, "Thank you. It was beautiful," in a tone so polished and false that I felt embarrassed standing inside it. One Sunday afternoon, I opened the digital album and stopped on a close-up shot of myself laughing during the parent toast. The photographer had caught the angle perfectly. Head tilted, smile lifted, shoulders relaxed. If you didn't know what had just been said, you'd think I was happy. I stared at that photo for a long time because it captured something I had been doing since I was a child, making pain look socially acceptable. Evan didn't pressure me to talk before I was ready. That, more than anything, made me talk sooner. He created space around me instead of pushing into it. On the nights when I woke up tense and silent, he never asked, "Are you still upset about your mom?" As if the wound were a repetitive inconvenience. He asked better questions. "What are you replaying? What did that remind you of? What part hurts the most today?" Those questions unlocked things I had spent years packaging into cleaner, smaller words. I told him about the dress shop when I was 16, when my mother said in front of a sales associate that Madeline could wear structured silhouettes because she had the kind of figure people enjoy looking at. Then turned to me and suggested darker colors were more forgiving. I told him about college graduation, when my father missed my departmental honors brunch because Madeline needed help choosing inventory for a pop-up event that failed 6 months later. I told him about the time I spent 2 full weekends repairing an error in one of my father's property tax filings, only to hear him later joke at Christmas that I was useful mainly because I worried enough for the whole family. Evan listened like a man taking witness statements for a case that had already gone on too long. The story stopped being about the wedding. The wedding had just been the first humiliation public enough that I could no longer explain it away. Around week 5, my mother started texting more often. Not apologies, never apologies, recipes, photos, an article about table settings, a comment about whether I had preserved my bouquet, a random question about whether Asheville had better antique stores than Raleigh. It was her usual method. Flood the channel with harmlessness until the original offense became rude to bring up. Madeline used another tactic. She sent me a reel of a bride crying during a speech with the caption, "At least your night wasn't this chaotic." I didn't answer either of them. Silence revealed more than argument ever had. My father, who rarely contacted me unless he needed something practical, sent a clipped text 2 weeks later. "Call me when you can. No greeting, no context." I knew that tone. It meant paperwork, money, an issue someone else had overlooked. I stared at the message and realized with a kind of sick clarity that every relationship in my family had been built around different access points to me. My mother used intimacy theater. Madeline used mockery and entitlement. My father used urgency. They all arrived at the same destination. Brooke will handle it. That realization unsettled me more than the wedding itself. Because humiliation is one thing, discovering that people have quietly organized their convenience around your emotional training is another. Around that time, I met Noelle for coffee on a rainy Thursday after work. The cafe windows were fogged, the table was too small, and my hands were wrapped so tightly around the cup that she finally said, "You don't need to make this sound reasonable for me." That undid me more than any dramatic speech could have. I told her everything in sequence: the toast, the terrace, the phone messages, the feeling that I was somehow both invisible and overused. Then I started listing things I had never said out loud in one place before. How I reviewed Madeline's lease before she opened the boutique because she didn't understand the penalty clauses. How I caught an insurance gap in one of my father's renovation properties before it turned into an underwriting problem. How I spent 3 separate evenings fixing a charity event budget my mother had mismanaged because she couldn't bear the embarrassment of asking her treasurer for help. Noelle blinked at me like I had just confessed to working a second unpaid career under the title daughter. "Brooke," she said carefully, "they don't just mistreat you, they budget around you." I actually laughed because it was so sharp and accurate it hurt. She leaned forward and lowered her voice. "You know what's happened, right? You became the family's correction mechanism. The person they insult because they think your role is permanent." Hearing it phrased that way altered the map in my head. I had always thought my pain came from not being chosen emotionally, but part of it came from being chosen functionally, relentlessly, as the person who would stabilize what others damaged. That night, after dinner, I sat at the kitchen counter with my laptop open and started tracing the invisible threads. The expiring financial review assistance attached to one of my father's vendor relationships. The lease amendment Madeline had texted me about, but I hadn't opened. The fundraiser summary my mother wanted me to just glance at. The recurring pattern of being contacted only when there was risk, embarrassment, or complexity involved. And for the first time, I stopped asking, "How do I get them to understand me?" and started asking, "What actually happens if I stop catching them before they fall?" The answer wasn't vindictive, it was structural. Things would wobble, costs would surface, delays would matter. Their confidence might finally have to compete with reality. A few nights later, while drying dishes, I told Evan, "I think I've been confusing love with assigned responsibility." He looked at me and said, "That's because they taught you to." Then he added, "You don't need a dramatic revenge plan. You need an exit from unpaid loyalty." That was when my thinking sharpened. I wasn't going to scorch the earth. I wasn't going to make a social media post, send a family group text, or weaponize their worst words in public. I was going to do something much more disruptive. I was going to become unavailable in every place they assumed I was permanent. The idea felt less like anger and more like oxygen. Over the next several days, I created a private record. Timelines, emails, saved texts, screenshots, reminders of every favor that had quietly become expectation. Not because I wanted to obsess over the past, but because women from families like mine are often trained to forget their own evidence the moment someone older says, "That's not what happened." I was done entering conversations with nothing but memory while everyone else brought denial. By the end of that month, something inside me had shifted from grief into design. They thought the wedding had proven I would take anything and keep smiling. What it had actually done was expose the final pattern too clearly to ignore. The daughter they mocked at the head table had started running the numbers. And once I started doing that, I knew exactly where the strain points were. The first person I called was my mother, Not because I expected accountability from her, but because I wanted one clean chance to say everything without witnesses. She answered on the second ring, sounding cheerful, already in performance mode. "Brooke, sweetheart, I was just thinking about you." I didn't bother with pleasantries. I told her I wanted to talk about the wedding. There was a pause so slight most people would have missed it, but I've made a career out of catching small shifts before they become liabilities. "What about it?" she asked. I said, "You stood up at my reception and humiliated me in front of everyone. Then later, I heard you laughing while Madeline joked that I was lucky anyone married me. Dad said Evan took me off your hands. I heard all of it." She didn't sound ashamed. She sounded annoyed that the hidden room had a witness. "Brooke," she said, drawing my name out in that tired, superior tone mothers use when they want to turn their daughters into overreactions. "You have always been too sensitive. It was a joke. Your sister was joking too. Nobody else took it that seriously." I asked her whether she remembered what she said at Madeline's wedding. She laughed once, sharp and dismissive. "Oh, please. Madeline's ceremony was different." I let the silence after that do its work. "Different how?" I asked. She tried to slide past it, but I didn't let her. Finally, she said the part mothers like mine usually believe they are too careful to say out loud. "Madeline doesn't make every family moment feel complicated. She knows how to let people enjoy things." There it was. The family translation key. Madeline equals easy to celebrate. Brooke equals difficult to love. I felt something inside me go cold and still. Not broken. Stabilized. "I'm recording this call," I told her. That was only half true. I had already started the recording before she answered, because after a lifetime of being told I remembered things too dramatically, I no longer entered hard conversations without a record. She inhaled sharply. "That is unbelievably manipulative." "No," I said. "What's manipulative is humiliating someone publicly, then calling them unstable when they object." She switched tactics fast, which was how I knew she was rattled. Suddenly she was offended, wounded, almost trembling. "After everything we've done for you?" I cut her off. "No, we are not doing that sentence anymore. I am done paying emotional interest on debts I never owed." She got quiet then, and when my mother got quiet, it usually meant she was recalculating where power had moved. I told her I would not discuss it again until she could speak without minimizing what happened. Then I hung up. I sat at my kitchen island with my phone face down and listened to my pulse settle. Evan came in from the other room, took one look at me, and asked, "Did she deny it?" I nodded. "Good," he said. "Now you know." He was right. Clarity can hurt, but it also ends negotiation with fantasy. The next morning, I contacted my bank and removed my personal advisory involvement from an expiring guarantee tied to one of my father's vendor obligations. I sent one professional email, signed one digital form, and declined to extend review assistance on a boutique lease amendment Madeline had texted me about the week before. No speeches, no threats, just absence where free labor used to be. That was the beginning, not the wedding, not the toast. The beginning was the day I stopped trying to win tenderness from people who preferred my usefulness. Madeline called me before I called her, which told me our mother had already delivered her edited version of the conversation. My sister didn't ask how I was. She went straight to outrage. "Did you seriously accuse Mom of ruining your wedding?" she snapped. "Brooke, you cannot keep doing this thing where you turn every joke into trauma." I leaned against my office window and watched rain gather on the glass. "You told people at my reception Evan was my last chance, and I'd still be single if I waited another year." She didn't even deny it. "Because it was funny," she said. And honestly, true enough. There are moments when cruelty becomes so casual it stops sounding personal and starts sounding inherited. I asked her whether humiliating me made her feel better about herself, or whether she had been trained so well by our parents that she couldn't tell the difference anymore. She laughed, low and mean. Here we go. Brooke the victim. You always need a grand emotional narrative. Mom makes one comment. I make one comment, and suddenly you're acting like you survived a war zone. Do you know how exhausting you are? I almost ended the call there, but then she added the sentence that finished the bridge. You should be grateful we even showed up smiling after everything you've put this family through. I asked, very calmly, what exactly have I put this family through, Madeline? And because arrogance makes people sloppy, she said more than she should have. She brought up money I had helped them with, but in the language of entitlement. She mentioned Dad's project, her boutique vendor issues. All those times, I handled paperwork, as if the labor had been a natural tax I owed for existing. I let her talk. I let her build her own evidence. By the time she hung up on me, I had something better than vindication. I had confirmation that none of them saw my help as generosity. They saw it as function. That evening, I created a private folder containing the wedding call recording, screenshots of recent messages, copies of advisory emails I had sent over the last 2 years, and a clean timeline of every quiet intervention I had made for my family. Not because I planned to post it anywhere, because I was done entering conversations unarmed while everyone else carried selective memory. A week later, my mother proposed a family dinner at my aunt's house, no doubt hoping a neutral table would pressure me into softness. I agreed, but on my terms. I asked them to come to my house instead. Evan would be there. No alcohol, no guests, no ambush audience. My father texted back one word: fine. Before the meeting, Noelle asked me whether I wanted reconciliation or distance. I told her I wanted the truth said out loud in a room where nobody could laugh it away. And after that? She asked. I thought about the wedding, the terrace, the phone calls, the years of unpaid emotional administration. After that, I said, they can decide whether they want a daughter or just a system they used to rely on. Maybe that sounds cold, but there comes a point when you stop asking whether standing up for yourself will make people uncomfortable and start asking why your silence was always supposed to be more polite than their cruelty. If your own family looked at your wound and called it overreacting, what would you do? Keep bleeding quietly? Or finally make them look at the blood? They arrived on a Saturday afternoon dressed like people coming to negotiate a misunderstanding instead of face the architecture of their own behavior. My mother brought lemon bars as if sugar could launder contempt. My father stood near the doorway with his hands in his pockets, already irritated by the fact that he couldn't dominate the room by speaking first. Madeline came in with that cool expression she used when she wanted everyone to know she considered herself above emotional scenes. I had arranged the living room deliberately. One couch, 2 chairs, no clutter, no easy escape into household distraction. Evan sat beside me but slightly back, close enough to support me, far enough that no one could accuse him of speaking for me. I started with the wedding. My mother tried to interrupt by minute 3. I told her she'd had 31 years of uninterrupted commentary, and she could manage 31 more minutes of listening. That shut her up. I described the toast exactly as it happened. Then I described what I heard near the terrace doors. Madeline rolled her eyes and said, "You're still doing that? We already said it was a joke." I reached for my tablet, pressed play, and let my mother's recorded voice fill the room. Too sensitive. Madeline's ceremony was different. She doesn't make every family moment feel complicated. The sentence landed harder in the room than it had on the call, because now it had witnesses who couldn't rewrite it. My mother's face drained first. My father turned toward her in disbelief. Not because he disagreed, but because he hadn't expected her to be documented saying it so cleanly. Before anyone recovered, I played the second clip. A piece of my call with Madeline where she called me exhausting, mocked my pain, and referred to my help as if it had always been owed. Madeline shot upright and demanded to know whether I had recorded her, too. Yes, I said, because all of you lie about tone after the damage is done. What followed was not the neat apology scene people imagine when they beg for truth. It was uglier and more useful. My father snapped at my mother for running her mouth. My mother turned on Madeline and said she had made everything worse at the wedding. Madeline, cornered, did what favored children do when accountability finally reaches them. She lashed downward. She pointed at me and said, "None of this would even matter if you weren't so desperate to compete with me all the time." That line hung in the air for exactly 2 seconds before my father muttered, "Madeline, enough," which might have been the first time in our adult lives he had ever corrected her in real time. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I opened the folder on the coffee table and slid printed copies toward them. Summaries of issues I had cleaned up, deadlines I had caught, advisory notes I had given, financial exposures I had quietly helped them navigate. My father looked down and recognized his development vendor problem immediately. My mother saw the line item tied to a tax penalty I had prevented the previous year. Madeline saw a lease review note with my tracked concerns about clauses she later told people she had handled herself. "This," I said, "is what you call dramatic. This is what you call difficult. This is what you laugh at in public. And this is everything I am no longer doing." My mother started crying then, but not delicately, not theatrically, the kind of crying that begins when control leaves the room faster than pride can chase it. She said she hadn't realized. I told her that was the most insulting possible answer. Of course she had realized. She just hadn't cared enough to stop. My father asked what I wanted. I said, "Nothing immediate. No rushed apology, no speech, no family photo version of healing. Here are my boundaries. I am not reviewing documents, covering emergencies, smoothing over payments, or attending family events where I am treated like comic relief. If there is ever going to be a relationship, it will begin with respect, not access." My mother reached for me. I stepped back. That hurt her more than any sentence I'd said. "This time," I told them, "I don't need you to say you're sorry. I need you to live long enough without my silence and my help to understand what you did with both." When they left, no one slammed a door. No one made a grand declaration. They just walked out looking like people who had finally been introduced to a bill they thought would never come due. And for the first time in my life, the room didn't feel empty after my family left. It felt clean. When people who built themselves on your accommodation are forced to hear their own words played back, do you forgive them because they're family? Or do you let consequence speak the language they ignored for years? 3 months later, on the morning my phone lit up with 38 missed calls, I was standing in my kitchen making coffee in one of Evan's old college t-shirts, looking out at the early blue haze over the mountains, and feeling more at peace than I had in years. Peace is a strange thing when you grew up earning affection by anticipating other people's needs. At first, it feels irresponsible. Then, if you protect it long enough, it begins to feel like truth. Since the meeting, I had kept every boundary. I didn't attend Madeline's birthday dinner. I didn't answer my father's vague, quick question texts about a contract vendor. I didn't help my mother rewrite an event budget she suddenly claimed was just a draft. I let every adult remain in possession of their own consequences. The first crack came in my father's development project, the one tied to the guarantee I had chosen not to extend. When a financing delay triggered vendor pressure, there was no clean bridge fix waiting in their inbox. The second crack came in Madeline's boutique. The lease amendment she ignored included a brutal inventory timing clause and a promotional penalty trigger I had warned about in my earlier notes. She blew through both. Then came the social part, which hurt them more than the money. My family had spent years curating an image of effortless success, polished events, easy relationships, smiling holiday tables, the kind of family people envied from a distance. But I had been one of the hidden mechanisms keeping that image functional. I was the one who noticed omissions, handled forms, checked numbers, kept tempers cool, remembered dates, repaired narratives, and turned chaos into something presentable. Without me, they didn't just lose free labor. They lost their illusion of seamlessness. That weekend, my mother hosted an anniversary lunch at their country club, and, for the first time anyone could remember, something actually went visibly wrong. A reservation error collided with a payment authorization issue, a florist delivery got sent back over an unpaid balance dispute, and my mother, who used to call me dramatic for planning contingencies, ended up crying in the ladies' room while guests whispered. Madeline had her own public unraveling when a vendor posted a passive-aggressive complaint online about missed obligations. None of this happened because I sabotaged them. That's the part I need to say clearly. I did not destroy their lives. I simply stopped protecting them from the natural consequences of being careless, entitled, and convinced that someone else would always absorb the embarrassment. The 38 calls came because my father's project was stalling. Madeline's store was bleeding cash. My mother's social circle had started asking pointed questions, and for the first time in years, no one in the family could reach for me without first remembering the sound of their own voices on those recordings. I called back only once, and only my father answered. He sounded older, smaller. He didn't start with authority. "Brooke," he said, "your mother's not doing well." I looked at the sunlight moving across my counter and remembered being 14, standing in a department store dressing room while my mother told me Madeline could wear a dress like that because she had the figure for attention. I remembered being 23 and helping my father fix a tax notice he said he was too busy to handle, only to hear him later tell relatives I'd finally made myself useful. I remembered my wedding day, the laugh, the terrace, the warm hand of my husband on my back while my own parents turned my joy into a line. The past didn't vanish because they were panicking in the present. "I'm sorry she's upset," I said, "but upset is not the same thing as accountable." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We miss you." It was almost enough to wound me, because for so many years that sentence was all I wanted. But people can miss your labor, your steadiness, your silence, your willingness to make things easier and still not know how to love you well. "You might," I said, "but missing me is not the same as respecting me." He asked if we could meet. I told him maybe, eventually, if all future contact began with honesty and stayed there. No jokes, no revisionist history, no treating me like the family utility drawer you all open only when something breaks. After I hung up, Evan set a mug beside me and kissed my temple. He didn't ask whether I was okay in the fragile way people sometimes do. He asked, "Do you regret any of it?" And I realized the answer was no. Not one boundary, not one silence, not one absence that finally taught other people my presence had value. The lesson I learned was simple, but it cost me years to believe it. Family love is not something you should have to audition for, bargain for, or earn through self-erasure. Real love does not require humiliation as an entry fee. Respect is not a bonus prize for the easiest daughter, the prettiest daughter, or the one most willing to keep the peace while being cut apart in public. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walk away long enough for people to feel the weight of what they took for granted. And when you choose yourself, you are not destroying your family. You are ending your participation in the version of it that survives by making you smaller. 3 months after my wedding, they called me 38 times because the daughter they mocked had quietly been holding up more of their world than they ever admitted. I didn't answer all 38. I didn't need to. By then, the silence was finally saying exactly what my words had failed to make them hear. Have you ever had to stand up and reclaim your worth from the people who were supposed to protect it first? Or are you still in that house, at that table, in that family role, telling yourself one more holiday won't hurt? Tell me your story. I promise you, I'll understand.